Okay. Yeah, well, late.
Up early today, huh?
Yeah, I see, with a lot of energy. Okay, we're going to talk about like Baimer fires. Let's just start like this. In 2022, there was a 800-year anniversary for the University of Padua in Padua, Italy, in northern Italy. They celebrated their 800th anniversary. The university actually still exists. They have like 65,000 students. It's considered a solid university still today in the world. And as part of their anniversary celebration, they made a special Jewish exhibit section to exhibit the Jewish connection that the community of Padua had with the University of Padua. And in that display, they had, for example, one of the prize things that they found was they had a Yiddish translation from the 1500s of a medical book about anatomy. Meaning Jewish students from Poland came to the university, the medical school, the University of Padua, and they needed to translate Flavius's anatomy book, which is like an early anatomy book, and they have a Yiddish translation. Many more similar items of Jewish interest that are related to the University of Padua. What is this major connection that the University of Padua has with the Jewish community that maybe other universities don't have? Is that the University of Padua in the late 1300s opened up their doors to Jews to join their medical school. It was the first university in Europe that allowed Jews to join the medical school. It was very rare, and many famous Jewish doctors over the next several hundreds of years studied in the University of Padua's medical school and became doctors. And that's why there was, a great Jewish connection that they were able to highlight by their anniversary. Now, from there arose a very interesting shaila. There's an Italian Talmud Chacham, I wouldn't say a Paisik, not a Paisik, he didn't write Chuvas. An Italian Talmud Chacham, he wrote Svarim on language, on diktuk, on speeches. A great Talmud Chacham, who knew a lot, very talented individual. His name was Rav Yehuda of Sierra Leone. He was a doctor, a graduate of the University of Padua, and he became such a proficient and accomplished doctor that he got special permission from the king to open his own junior medical school, call it a bachelor's degree in medicine, and then from there you matriculate and go on to a real university to get your doctorate. So Rabbi Yehuda of Sierra Leone was allowed to open a medical college of some variety. He lived in the city of Mantova, another city in Italy not too far away from Padua, and he opened a junior medical school. Now him, and at that time, the Rav of Mantova was Rav Yosef Cologne. Rav Yosef of Cologne is the Marik, a very Yisaidistic Tshuva Sefer, something that the Shulchan Aruch and the Beis Yosef bring down many times. The Marik is a very Yisaidistic Tshuva Sefer. He was the Rav of Mantova at the time that Rabbi Yehuda of Sierra Leone opened his junior medical college in Mantova. Now, as in every medical school today, Goldstein's and Shemi's not here, but as in every medical school today, there's a very specific uniform that you wear, and everybody wears it, and there's not, you come with your uniform. So now, he co-opted whatever the uniform was in the University of Padua, from where he matriculated, and he took the white robes that we know today as a doctor, and he said, everyone in my classes in the University of the junior medical school of Mantova needs to wear white robes. You're a doctor now. You're not just a hamaynam. You wear robes. So they wore the robes, and there arose like a big tumult and stuff. Some people said that the robes is b'chukasem le'selechu. It's darkei amari. This is a gayish mode of dress. This is not how Jews dress. This is a gayish mode of dress. What's going on? Why are you encouraging your students to wear non-Jewish clothing? It became a big tumult. Now, like I said, Rabbi Yehuda of Sierra Leone was not just a doctor, he was a great Talmud Chacham, and he wrote an arichas tshuva to defend his position that this is not darkei amari, and he'll explain why this is okay. Now, being that he wasn't the actual Rav of the city at this time, and he had some amount of deference to the Marik, to Rabbi Yosef Cologne, he sent his letter to the Marik to look it over. And Tshuva Peiches, in the Shalos Tshuvas Marik, is a response to Rabbi Yehuda of Sierra Leone, reviewing his tshuva on this shaila about the medical school in Mantova where they both lived. As an interesting postscript, Tzim Seif, the Marik and Rabbi Yehuda of Sierra Leone end up having a great parting of ways, where both of them were put up for the stellar of the chief rabbi of Italy, whatever that meant at that time, and their camps ended up fighting with each other, and they both got kicked out of the city of Mantova. Neither one of them dies there. They both die in other places. They both got kicked out. But at this point, they were close, and the Marik writes what is probably the most yisaidistic tshuva about darkei amari, about b'chukasem le'selechu. This becomes the gold standard, the kriyas, of how to understand b'chukasem le'selechu. And the Marik lays down two concepts, he says. He says, Tamazay, if you find that Goyim wear something or do something, and a Jew does it also. For example, let's say Corona. Every guy is wearing a mask. It's a very Goyish zach. Everyone's wearing a mask. Maybe Jews can't wear masks. But the Jews invent to wear masks. It comes from Goyim. Can't wear masks. Says the Marik. Of course not. Says the Marik. Listen, that's a sensible thing. People wear masks because they need to wear masks. It's not something that you're wearing als Goyishkeit. You wear it to protect yourself, to help yourself. So, of course, one could wear a mask. You don't say b'chuk yisayim. The Marik says there are only two types of usage, two types of wearings or doings that are called that you're in violation of this or b'chuk yisayim l'sileichu. He says A is a simple one. A is one that has a pagam and sneas or something like that. Meaning it's an inappropriate mode of dress because it's an inappropriate mode of dress. It's something that has to do with sneas. That's something that's not allowed, says the Marik. The second one, he says, yeah. No, so because we're not talking about sneas like something's uncovered. We're talking about sneas like dark, the yeah. Also, so we're talking about like even the spirit of Natsanua, even the what's it called, the Das Yehudis, not just the Das Moshe, even the Das Yehudis for a man, the equivalent of Das Yehudis for a man is included in this of not wearing Goyish clothing. The second one that the Marik says, and this is the one that is more relevant to us, the Marik says is Yesayid as follows. The Marik says that anything that Goyim do for a reason, because it makes sense, because it's for something, that's not B'chuk Yisayim. B'chuk Yisayim, he says, is when Goyim do something that appears to be strange. There's no Havana in why they're doing this. It's like, is that like, I don't know, we just do this. We wear red hats on Tuesdays. We wear black shoes on the 5th of May. And no one in the community knows why they're doing it. No one has an idea. Says the Marik, the assumption is that something that's a chayk for the Goyim, it's like a well-established rule that we do X, Y, and Z, and nobody knows the reason, Mistama that's outside of the Zara. Mistama that stems from the Zara, and that's the second type of B'chuk Yisayim L'Sileichu. That's Asar Tzarkei Mari. That's what the Marik says. And to this he brings many rayas from several Gemaras that prove this point, that the only things that are Asar are things that are just chayk hagayim, that don't have a tam. For example, he brings this Gemara in Bab Basra that talks about wearing begadim l'havriach bayis hamechas. To avoid paying taxes, one wants to wear clothing, and it seems that there was different taxes paid on clothing that were for sale and clothing that were not for sale. That's one mahalach in learning the Gemara. Other Rishonim learned the Gemara that goyim didn't have to pay taxes. A goyish clothing, a goyish article of clothing didn't have to pay taxes. This was these taxes that we're discussing in the Gemara Bab Basra and Daf Kufi Gimel are punitive taxes against Jews. Jewish clothing, bekishes have a special tax. And what the Gemara is telling you is you're allowed to wear, you're allowed to be leivish to beged lavriach hasamechas, means you could put on goyish suit, not a bekisha, lavriach hasamechas. Says the Marik, you're wearing a goyish suit. Zak the Marik, no, it's very sensible. You wear the suit because this is not a taxable suit, and this is a taxable suit, and I don't want to pay taxes now. It says, Vaistis in the Gemara Babasa, that that's not B'chuk Yisayim. B'chuk Yisayim is only a chak b'li tam. If there's a chak b'li tam, that's B'chuk Yisayim l'Sileichu. That's Darkei Mari. And he brings more rayas to this, and it's not important to us every single one of his rayas. There's a second nekuda in the Marik that's important, and that is he handles as follows. He brings a raya from Gemara to this, two Gemaras to this. He handles, let's say, something that's equally Jewish, like it's Goyish. Meaning, we both started at the same time. We both started doing the same hanhaga at the same time. But then over time, it became less Jewish and more associated with Goyim. It became like a very primary Goyish meaning, and it was to Jews, it was like it's a neutral. I mean, we started doing it, it comes from nowhere, it's not Avodah Zarah, it's not bad. We started at the same time, but it kind of fell into disuse by Jews, and it became much more of like a primary Goyish minig by the Goyim. Does that have a din of B'chuk Yisayim l'Sileichu? And on this, the Marik says that anything that started innocuously, and it's be'etzim as Yiddish as it is Goyish, there's no din B'chuk Yisayim, even if it becomes mamish, like something that they do. Unless, and there's one exception, unless, and that's, I just want to read this Gemara in Avodah Zarah for a second, and with this we'll have all the background I think that we need for Darkei Mari. There's a Gemara in Avodah Zarah in Daf Aleph that says as follows. It says, Tanya, Sarfin ala malachim, v'loi mi Darkei Mari. We're allowed to burn on kings, and it's not Darkei Mari. Now, Sarfan HaMalachim, what the Gemara is referring to is that there's a minig, and this minig is a minig vasik that's brought down in Psukim. The Psukim in Yecheskel, the Psukim in Devrei Hayamim. It's muskar in the Psukim, that the minig was, back in the day, that when a king died, you would take all his personal effects, his clothing, his chairs, all his personal effects, and you'd burn it. And that was a way of saying, like, like there's no, al kisei le'yeshiv zar. Nobody's gonna going to walk in King Frederick's coat again. It's gone. It's burnt. But this is not something that was exclusively Goyish. This is something that Jews did also. The pasuk in Yecheskel, the pasuk in the Yamim talks about Asa when he died that they burnt his clothing. And the pasuk in Yecheskel is a nevuah where Yecheskel says, I believe he's telling, I don't remember, that the pasuk in Yecheskel says, "B'shalom tamus u'kemisrafeis avesecha hamalachim harishayim ashahilu fenecha ken yisrafu lecha." Yecheskel is giving a nevuah to a king, and he's saying, "You're going to die at peace." And the way they burnt your father's personal effects, they'll burn your personal effects. It was a great zach of kavod to do for a king. Now, kaniref in the Gemara that over time this became more Goyish than Yiddish, because the Gemara has to behandle it. The Gemara brings a brayso that says Tanya sarfan al malachim and there's ein b'mishum darkei amori. Now, it sounds like from that by the Jewish kehillah it kind of fell into disuse. It wasn't something that was commonly associated with a Jewish minhag anymore. But Afal Pikin says the Gemara, Heyois, it's be'etzem a Jewish minhag, just like it's a Goyish minhag. So sarfan al malachim ein b'mishum darkei amori. That's one way to learn the Gemara. The other way to learn the Gemara, and this is it's totally in Machlik Zishayim, is that what the Gemara is saying. Okay, one second, hang on. Let's finish the Gemara. So the Gemara says, "Sarfan al-malachim Tanya, sarfan al-malachim v'lei midarkei amori." The Gemara asks, "Vi chukehi anan hechi sarfino and I've aksiv v'chukeseim leisei leichu." If this is a chayka akum, this is a halacha, this is like something goyim do. I ain't allowed to do that. It says v'chukeseim leisei leichu. So Elamai zok the Gemara, the kuli alma streifa lav chukehi. Streifa is not a chukah. It has nothing to do with chukas hagoy. Ela chashivusahi. It's something that's done for chashivus. So now, it's a different type of thing. It's not something that's done out of chayk that has to do with avodah zarah, that has to do with goyim, do it for an unexplained reason. This is a very fashtan l'chazach. It's something that's done for a very simple reason. In order to give cover to the king, to show that nobody's going to come to the king, we burn his clothing. Okay, so then the Gemara continues. Ukashem shasarfan al malachim, kach sarfan al nesiim. Just like you serif on a king, you burn a king's clothing. You also burn a nasi's clothing. Umahim sarfan al malachim. What do you burn by a king? Mitasan, klitashmishan. You burn their bed and their clothing. Umaiser shemeiser Gamliel Azakin, who was the nasi. One time, Rav Gamliel Azakin, who was the nasi, died. V'sarif alav onkelis hager shivim manatsuri. And onkelis hager burnt on him, on his death, 70 mana, which is a large amount, a big weight of clothing, 70 manatsuri. The Gemara of Amrit Mayin Sarfan Aleim Mitasim Klitashmishan. We literally just finished saying you only burn a very limited amount of things. You don't burn, the whole village every time the king dies. So the Gemara says, no, Ema b'shivim manatsuri umidechrini lay. B'shivim manatsuri. Maybe it just means taka that Rav Gamliel Azakin was a wealthy man and his personal effects were so large that they were shivim manatsuri. That's what the Gemara says. Now, over here, Taisus has a question. Taisus says. The Gemara says that we have a raya from this that it's not chukah. These things are not because chukas hakam. These things are mishum kavod, right? Because if they were chukas hakam, would be aser. Frak Taisus says, what's the raya that it's not chukas hakam? Maybe the reason why you do this is because it's mafurish in the pasuk. Who cares if it became chukas hakam? But something that's mafurish in the pasuk, it doesn't fall away, even if it's chukas hakam. And Taisus brings a raya like that a hanhaga that's musker in the pasuk mafurish, it doesn't change even if goyim change it later on. And Taisus has a teretz. Taisus says v'yeshleima that there's a difference. Things that become associated with avodah zara, even if they're musker in the pasuk, they could fall away. Something that becomes specifically associated with avodah zara, then even something that was once beloved to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, something that was once even an avodah for HaKadosh Baruch Hu, like matzevis or priestess kapayim or different types of anhagis that we do, but they later on became associated with avodah zara, they fall away. B'chukesem could ask you from doing that. But things that are not associated with avodah zara, they just become goyish, associated with the culture of the goyim. That's something that we don't say b'chukesem if they're musker in the pasuk. Okay, this is the background information for the sugi of b'chukesem l'seleichu, the sugi of darkei meir. Now, the Marik is Gepaskin, just as a point of record, the Marik is Gepaskin in Shulchan Aruch like this, in Yeridei, in Tzim Kufay and Ches, the Ramah brings the Marik, the Darkei Amori is only Aser if it's Mishum Tznius, or it's Chayka Akum, an unexplained, Milsa B'lei Taima, an unexplained Chayka Akum, where one has to be suspect that probably this is something that's Avodah Zarah related. As is Gepaskin to the Ramah, and that's how this Marik makes it to Shulchan Aruch. Now let's get to the today's Inyan. Okay, so I want to talk about, like Bleimer fires, the similarity should be jumping at you right away. The Gemara that I just read through, the similarity should be jumping off the page, like upon him. It's not a Weite Zustel, but let's just talk about it in a organized fashion. So, obviously, there's no Gemara that talks about like Bleimer fires. There's also no Rambam, no Shulchan Aruch, and that's just, let's get that out of the way. Get that out of the way, there's no Rambam, there's no Shulchan Aruch, there's no Gemara that talks about Lag BaOmer fires. So when did the Lag BaOmer fires really get started? So in the article that Teddy shared, it says, the Velt brings down that there's a letter from the Bavadi Bar Tanura, who incidentally is the biggest Talmud of the Marik, is the main Talmud of the Marik. There's a letter from Bavadi Bar Tanura when he went to Eretz Yisrael in the early 1500s, where he writes about Lag BaOmer fires. But it's a tayis. If you look in the earlier editions of the Radi Ratanur's letters, he's writing about a minhag, it's still relevant to us. It's still similar and relevant, but it's not like BaOmer fires. He says when he got to Yerushalayim, not Miron, and the day was Chav Ches Ir, not like BaOmer, they were burning a fire outside the kever of Shmuel Hanavi, not Rav Shimon ben Yochai. So it's just not like BaOmer and Miron, but again, it's a very similar concept. You're starting to see the idea that there was a fire related to yard sites at the kever of a person. The Ratanur brings that. Now, what happened eventually is that minhag of lighting a fire by the kever of Shmuel Hanavi became disbanded because the local Arab rulers stopped allowing it.
Is that a bonfire or candle?
A bonfire.
Like
No, a bonfire lighting clothing. 1 second, I want to get to that. A bonfire, and they disbanded that minhag so much so.
Which clothing did they burn?
1 second. So much so that by the time the Bavadi Batanur's letters were published 100 years later, the Madfis, the guy who was putting it out, had no idea that there once was a minhag to light at Shmuel Hanavi's kever, and he couldn't make sense of what was going on there, and he changed one detail, and the next Madfis after him changed another detail, so that by the time he got to the mid-1700s, Itaka says, in the Shiva Tzion, Itaka says, I got to you to Miron, Mamash, in case of broken telephone. So the Radi Ratanur, which would give us an extra, 250 years over the sources that we do have that talks about it, that's a tayis. So that's brought down like that, but that's a tayis. That's not a real thing. Now, what he does tell us though is a minhag of making a fire, a bonfire, outside the kever of someone on his yard site. And also another interesting component that he tells us about is he says that they were burning clothing. He says everyone would come and they would take off their headgear or their jacket and they would throw it in the fire. They would burn clothing. Now, burning clothing is we arrive at a second question. Besides for the Shaila of Darkei Amori, the Shaila of origin of something, we arrive at the Shaila of Baltashkas. You take a perfectly good suit and you throw it into a fire for a kever on a yard site. What about Baltashkas? That's the second question that arises. So 1 second. So this is about the Ratanur where you see a lot of the familiar components of the Sreifa that happens in Miron. Now, where does the actual Sreifa Miron start from? So there, it's much, much later. It's taka like in the 17 and 1800s, where you start seeing many travelers write that they came to Miron and they saw fires. Now again, it wasn't tens of thousands of people. It was a small event, but they came, they write, they saw fires and like BaOmer at the kever of Rav Shimon ben Yochai and Miron, etc. Now, how did so just as a matter of record, how did like BaOmer come to be associated with Rav Shimon ben Yochai? So in Shulchan Aruch, if you look, the Ramah brings down, we don't say Tachnun on like BaOmer, but it has nothing to do with Rav Shimon ben Yochai. The reason why we don't say Tachnun like BaOmer comes from Maril. It says because it's the day that we know the Gemara in Yivamas and Daf Samach Beis says that the 12,000 Zugei Talmidim Rav Akiva died ben Pesach Latzeres, and the Gemara doesn't say that they stopped dying like BaOmer. That's not in the Gemara, but the Maril brings down from Meiri that on like BaOmer they stopped dying, and therefore like BaOmer is the day that we don't say Tachnun, we don't say Nachem, you don't do anything that's Mishum Avelos on like BaOmer because the Talmidim Rav Akiva stopped dying. Now the kasha is, and many Rishonim asked this, is that they didn't stop dying like BaOmer. They died, the Gemara clearly says, Ben Pesach Latzeres. So there's answers, many different answers. Some say cumulatively they only died on 32 days or 33 days out of the whole 49 days of Sfira, and this was an off day, so we do this day. There's many different roots in Malchavanim, but like BaOmer was the day that was associated with the stopping of the death of the Talmidim of Rav Akiva. Now, after Rav Akiva's Talmidim died, the Gemara tells us that the Gemara Baba Kama says, after all Rav Akiva's Talmidim died, the world was pashut desolate. There was no more Mesiras HaTorah. There was no one to give over Torah to. All Rav Akiva's Talmidim were gone. So it says that Shabar Rav Akiva Eitzel Rabbeinu Shebegalil. Rav Akiva came to the Rabbanim in the Galil up north, and he chose 5 new Talmidim, and he taught those Talmidim, and from there Yatzis Torah Yisrael. And those Talmidim is Reb Yehuda, Reb Meir, Reb Shimon ben Yochai, Reb Elazar, and Tarfon is Rebbe. Tarfon Reb Yeshua is Rebbeim. It's one more. And Ad Kedei Kach, we say from there Stam Sifra is Rabbi Yehuda Bar Ilai al pi Rabbi Akiva. Stam Sifri is Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai al pi Rabbi Akiva. Stam Masnisan is Rabbi Meir al pi Rabbi Akiva. And Stam one more. So meaning the Gemara says Kilu like Kol HaTorah Kula came through these 5 Talmidim that Rabbi Akiva did round 2. Like the second iteration of Rabbi Akiva's Talmidim is Mamash Kol HaTorah Kula. All the Mishnahs at Tanoim, everything we know from the Tanoim comes through Rabbi Akiva's 5 Talmidim. So some Kubalim said that like Ba'omer was the day that Rabbi Akiva got his new Talmidim. What do you say? Smicha got his new Talmidim on that day. So Memela, it's the day we celebrate like the Mesiras HaTorah. The Mesiras HaTorah. Ad Kedei Kach, that I saw yesterday in the Sefer of Yaakov Hillel, that there used to be a minhag that people in Tveria went to Reb Meir's kever, and people in Miron went to Reb Shimon Yochai's kever, and people in, I forgot, Rabbi Yehuda Bar Ilai is buried, we know where he's buried, went to, what did you say?
Burial.
Where?
It's called burial.
Burial. So they went to Yehuda Bar Ilai's kever, meaning the minhag was to go to anyone, whichever one of Rabbi Akiva or his 5 Talmidim that you would find yourself near, you'd go to the kever, because this is the day that we celebrate the Mesiras HaTorah. But once the Mekubalim, Rabbi Arizal and Talmidim with Arizal, then it became much more specific to Rabbi Shimon Yochai. There's a Rabbi Shimon Yochai on the day that he dies, or the day that he dies, he writes in the Idra like a great description of his death, and that became the minhag to read that on like Ba'omer. Now, to celebrate specifically Rabbi Shimon Yochai. Now, the idea that Rabbi Shimon Yochai's yard site is like Ba'omer is even later than this. Because originally, the tzur of Rabbi Shimon Yochai has to do with like Ba'omer is no different than Rabbi Yehuda Bar Ilai and Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yosi and Rabbi Eliezer. It's the Talmid of Rabbi Akiva. It's the Rabbi Akiva connection that brings it like Ba'omer. That it becomes his yard site is only later on. I think the first one that I saw brings it down is Rabbi Yonis in Eibshitz. That's already like mid 1700s. He says we have a Messiah that the yard site the day that Rabbi Shimon Yochai was nifter is like Ba'omer. And Memela, they get the whole Zilula of Rabbi Shimon Yochai and etc. So all I'm showing is that it's not really a very, very old minhag. The idea that like Ba'omer, the way we have it very simply in our mind, that like Ba'omer is the day that we celebrate the yard site of Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai. The way we celebrate it is by lighting a fire in Miron. The song we sing is Bar Yochai. Hang on, we'll get to that piece in a second. Is all very, very relatively recent Minhagim. The song Bar Yochai, for example, once we're on the whole trip, the song Bar Yochai is made up by someone, Yitzchak Lavi, or Lavi. He was a Spanish Jew. He was kicked out of Spain in 1492. He moves to North Africa. He ends up becoming the Rav in Tripoli, to a very, very small Amaratzistic community who knew very, very little. And Fakir, he made it like his life's mission to stay there and teach them, because he felt like without him, the whole thing would collapse on itself. So he stays in Tripoli, and he writes the song, this piyut, Bar Yochai. It's 11 Pizmonim. If you look now, you'll see his name, Shimon ben something Levi, is signed off in acrostic. It's there. It's you could see his name in the song, Shimon Levi. Now the song itself was lost. He lived in a tiny Jewish kehillah in Tripoli. It wasn't known. No one really knew of the song. When he put it out, let's say in 1550, let's say for argument's sake, let's give or take a few years. He put it in 1550. The song was lost for about 250 years. Until some of the rich Jews of Tripoli decided to come together and publish his svarim. They published 2 svarim from him, a pirush on Zayar called Kesem Paz, and his song Bar Yochai, which I have at home, a sefer, like probably 300 pages fat, from a Satmar guy who did like a bir on Bar Yochai and shows how every word, every vav, every hay in there is coming from somewhere. There's 800 marmakaims from the Zayar that are contributing to write the song of Bar Yochai. There's nothing from Kisvei Arizal, because Kisvei Arizal were not out yet. Shimon Levi did not even have Kisvei Arizal. He was based on the Zayar. 800 like bullet points that he's using to write Bar Yochai. So it's definitely a tremendous kishrin and a huge bekiyas in Zayar that's wrapped up in the song. Meaning the song is taka conveying, it's hitting all the spots of Rav Shimon of the Zayar, etc. No, the tune is the tune. But v'chalaifin, again, it's something that was first published like in the early 1700s, and then caught on from there and became very popular. This year, someone sent me a kol kaira from people in Yerushalayim that the nusach that we say lekavid hatana Elokai is very problematic, because Elokai means my Hashem, my God. You're supposed to say lekavid hatana Eloki, a Tana of Hashem. A Tana Elokai refers to the Tana as Elokai. as opposed to Tana Eleki. There's a Kalkaira to fix the song, meaning to fix the bitoy, to fix the way people pronounce the song. And this goes to what we were talking about. It has more to do with the tune, because things have to fit. You can't just change Nakudis. But B'chalefen, what I'm just a little backdrop of the whole Indian is that it's a pretty recent minhag. So now comes the poskim. I feel like it took a long time to give the hakdamas. Okay, but now comes some of the poskim and have tainus on these minhagim. The Chasam Sefer, first amongst the Chasam Sefer. Chasam Sefer in Tshuva and Yeridea and Siman Reish Lamed Gimel. Chasam Sefer brings a Gemara in Rosh Hashanah that says that Bizman Hazeh Megillas Tainus was batal. All the happy days that we don't do Tanesim and we don't fast is batal. Because the Gemara says, Achshav, that we're in Galus and we have so much tsaris, like, don't tell me about old Yamim Tovim, that things, used to be good, used to be thing. Says, and the Gemara says that came along later, Miron, they were being Meisif. And other Miron says, Al Rishainim, we're saying to get rid of them. And you're coming to be Meisif more Yamim Tovim, more fake holidays? Like, so it says L'chem Sefer, but like Ba'imr, Al Rishainim, we have a hard time making sense of. And you're adding more Yamim Tovim. I don't know what this is. I don't know. He says, says to be kaveh yamtiv on a day that no nes was done and it's not musker and shasa paiskim, not b'shum makam v'remez v'remiza, rak menias hesped v'tainis minhagu v'taim agufa le'yadana. Says the only thing that is mentioned in the paiskim is not to give a hesped like Baimer, and even that I don't really know the reason. And he continues like this, and Chasam Sefer Stamazah, he asks that on a hilula of a tzaddik, the day a tzaddik dies is a hard day, it's a bad day, it's not a good day. What's the partying on the day a tzaddik dies? Chasam Sefer is very perturbed by the whole minhag. He says, Yartzeitzud keeps the proper decorum, that's fine, yeah. You could even sing Bar Yechai by the Yartzeitzud, no. But Chasam Sefer, he strangely, he says like, Lo yedati em rashayim lasis ken, he says. Ukein mashakasav rabach mishnad lekever shmol anavi yoin sham. The Chasam Sefer brings that old minhag of kever shmol anavi, of burning things, and he says there's a Ralbach that said that's questionable. And he says I don't know if this is permitted to do. I don't know if this is allowed. Says Chasam Sefer, which is interesting. Chasam Sefer is usually very decisive. It's a yes or a no, and we hear Chasam Sefer he does leave it open, on some level. He expresses his displeasure, but leaves it open. That's Chasam Sefer. Now, the Chasam Sefer doesn't go into specific tainus on the anhaga of the hilula. He just handles klaliistic, like to make a new yamtif, like a hey azal, like to make a new yamtif. That's what the Chasam Sefer is. That's what he's upset about. He looks at this like a hey year. He's not critiquing specific facets of the hilula. But the Shalom Meshiv in the Tshuva says as follows. The Shalom Meshiv says, Minig sheshamati, the B'erka dish tzvas, okay, which it's close enough, tzvas Miron. They light expensive clothing. They light expensive clothing, things that are worth $300, $500 a suit. Can you do it? The Rizhiner, Rabbi Yisrael of Ruzhin, the Rizhiner Rebbe, used to send a very expensive bekisha to be burnt at like Baimer always. The Rizhiner, we know, bought the rights to the burning, right? That's by Biyan, Adiyah Mazeh still has it. But the Rizhiner sent every year would send an expensive bekisha as part of the minhag to burn on the Maduran like Baimer. So the Shalom Meshiv writes, Shamati, that there's this minhag, Shekarchem Oisei B'Shem, and they wrap these clothing up, they soak these clothing in oil. Matlikin. Says the Shalom Meshiv, Ve'eni moitzi b'zet tzad heter. I don't see a tzad heter in this. The nearer the ikar iser, bal tashchis derabanan. It is an iser bal tashchis derabanan. Ve'eni maimin she'rishanim nagu kain. Ich glaub nicht that the Rishonim did this, said the Shalom Meshiv. I can't believe that anyone before did this. Shalom Meshiv was not a historian, and he wasn't doing any research to know when. He says, it's pashut to me that this is a newish minhag. This is not something that the Rishonim were doing. That filu b'simchas beis hashayeva, in the Beis HaMikdash, by the Simchas Beis Sheva, they only burnt the ruin, the ones that were used up. You didn't take perfectly good clothing and throw them into fire for Hilul, if anything. Says that can't be that it's mutter. Then he says, maybe the Gemara Navay Zara that we started with, maybe Sarfan al Malachim, maybe this is covered from Malachim. The Imishim the Sarfan al Malachim, Ein Zekiyim b'Malachim. That's only by kings. A. Ube'es Misa, days. It's only at the time of their death. And 3, it has a limit. We only burn certain things. And Azayis Gepaskin the Shulchan Aruch, that you only burn those things. Ve'im sheyadati gedulas Rashbi zal v'shamayim mimal v'al haaretz. Chas v'shalom says the Shalom Eshev, I'm not trying to minimize or diminish the godless of Rishon ben Ichai. I'm aware of that. Ach yadati ki lo lefanav chenaf yavai. V'li b'yemeli de'ein ritzayne b'kach. I'm pretty sure Rishon ben Ichai doesn't want you to do this, says the Shalom Eshev. And then he says,
about burning the clothing?
Burning the clothing of the meter. He's not talking about just making a fire or singing, burning the clothing. He says, "Be'emes harbi yesh l'dabra mashinagu lisif b'gadol malav lag ba'imur." I have a lot to say about this. The over on Batashkes, the over on B'chugisem le'silechu. But he says, "Lamaisa." He ends off Kishem, which is similar, reminiscent of the Sefer. Kishem shemitzvah leim davar nishma, just like it's a mitzvah to say something that people are going to listen to. Kach mitzvah shaloi leim davar shein nishma. It's also a mitzvah not to say something people don't want to hear. So he says, I don't know what to do for you. I can't. Meaning, at his point, at the point the Shalom Eshev is riding, the train already left the station. Shalom Eshev is like, listen, I think it's usher. I don't think it's okay. I don't think Rishon ben Ichai wants you to do it. But Kishem shemitzvah leimer, I'm not going to make a fuss. I'm not going to come and make a big fuss. Now this tshuva from the Shalom Eshev inspired a big response. There's a sefer called Kvoid Melachim from Rav Shmuel Heller. Rav Shmuel Heller was the Rav. Actually, the Rav of Tzfas in the early 1800s was the Basayan. The Chassidish Rav of Tzfas in the mid 1800s was the Basayan. He had a big Talmud of Shmuel Heller, who becomes the Rav of Tzfas after him. He takes over after him. Rav Shmuel Heller wrote a whole sefer called Kvoid Melachim to be, in defense of this minhag of Sreifas begadim and the fire in general.
Pro or against?
Pro, big defense, very pro. And he uses all these zachan that we started with. He brings the marik, that's something that isn't Goyish or isn't Yiddish, doesn't become Darkei Emeiri. He brings many Maramakamis that Baltashchis is only if it serves you no purpose. But if it serves you a purpose because it's part of your Avodah or it's part of your Kavod or it's part of whatever you want it to be, that's not Baltashchis. He brings many Gemaras like that. And then at the end he brings that different interpretations of how to learn the Gemara of Sefer and Al Malachim, that it could include, he has a mashmayis from some Rishonim that the minhag was every yard site of the king, they would burn more clothing for him. So Sefer and Al Malachim could be with yard sites, and you see from Rebbe that Rebbe Gamliel Azakin that even a Nasi counts, and Kavachimer of Shem Ben Yechai, and what do you say? Man Malki Rabbanon, etc. It's not a very long sefer. It's about 40 pages long, and he brings this whole defense of it with all the Chazal and all the Gemaras. And
it's all defense.
There is no makar, no. So his point is, what you see from the Marik is that something doesn't have to have a Yiddish and makar in order to not be B'chukisei.
He's just defending all the shaykhs.
Yeah, it just shouldn't be Goyish. If it's just
no makar at all.
No, so the makar for fires.
Yeah.
So there's no, what do you mean a makar? There's things from a few hundred years ago people write about doing it. We more find that the minhag developed. Afterwards, you find people saying reasons for it. Actually, you want to know a reason why we burn clothing? A reason why we burn clothing is because the Gemara tells us that Rishon ben Ichai went into the cave. What do you say?
That's still done.
No. So 1 second. So the Gemara tells us that Rishon ben Ichai went into a cave and he took off his clothing so they shouldn't get ruined. Then he went up to his neck in mud and he learned. So Rishon ben Ichai achieved in the Ma'ara a darga of like Adam Rishon Kaidem Achet. This is the Rashi Lekutna says this, but Rashi Lekutna is in 1870. It's a long time. It's more Achrei Amaisa, writing a tam.
People are more associated with Kabbalah.
Yeah, more associated with Kabbalah and Chasidus and whatever. But he says that Rashi Lekutna writes that he achieved the level of Adam Rishon Kaidem Achet, and to be maskir that we burn clothing on like Bayim or Chadaima. There are other similar time like that. Now I think what ends up happening is this kind of a pshara. The fire part, which is just call it, let's say, it doesn't really come from anywhere. There's no actual makar to burn a fire by someone's yard side. But the Mekubalim held that it had a lot of meaning and things that we don't understand and whatever. So that, became very popular. That went on. The specifically burning clothing, which was more karach and specific isurim, like Batashchis or B'chugisei and Leisilechu, that the Paiskim, what do you say?
Oil you still do.
Who?
Still pour oil.
Oil, sure, yeah, that's just the fire. Yeah, that's for the fire. You want to make a fire.
No, gallons and gallons.
You want to make a big fire. That's a usage, but
That's a sale.
yeah, that's a sale. See, that's a perfect usage, exactly. So the Akabana made some sort of try. I just want to end off with one zach. I read there was a kollel in Yerushalayim in the 50s, the early 50s, before Miron was super popular, that went up to Miron for Lag BaOmer. And they, on the way back, they made a stop in Bnei Brak by the Chazon Ish. And the Chazon Ish looked at them and says, what are you doing here? It's the middle, you don't have Seder today? And they said, no, we went to Miron, and on the way home, we decided we'll stop here, we had some things to talk to you about. And the Chazon Ish says, I never heard of this. I don't know. The Chazon Ish was unhappy with them. When they left, the people in the Chazon Ish's house asked the Chazon Ish, so does the Rebbe hold that it's usher to go to Miron? You're not allowed to do it? Is that what you're saying? Chazon Ish was quiet. He looked at them and he said, Azach was tausend Yidden nemen ruchnius von, me megnish sagen as to usher. That's what the Chazon Ish said. The Chazon Ish, who never went to Miron like in his life, obviously, and was disappointed that young light that came to him went to Miron, expressed very clearly this idea that we all know, that a zach that became, even if it's new, and even if it's hard to exactly figure out where the Minhagim come from, and what they exactly mean, and what they service, something that today, I don't know, hundreds of thousands of Yidden shep real ruchni is from, you can't say anything bad about. So I'm just giving a background, and the poskim who, in their day, had critiques, and maybe how their critiques affected, like, moving it into a way that, had less problems, and happy like Baimer to us all.
Xavier says somewhere, I think, no?
Okay, good morning. As we come to the end of the season and the end of the series on hair and beards, shaving, etc., I would be remiss if I didn't talk about upsharons. So really, it's maybe like my Baimer topic, but I'll have to just get it out of the way. So I just want to start like this as follows. There was a famous traveler. His name was Rabbi Yaakov Safir. He was a Yid from Vilna who moved to Yerushalayim. He became part of the Kilo of the Prushim. He was a Safra the Daini. He worked for the Bezdin. He was a Safra the Daini. He was Talmud Chacham. His son-in-law put out a kuntrus that was published like once a month for many, many years, and he wrote a lot in it. He had a lot of tshuvas about Esrogim, Murkavim, and different Messiahs of Esrogim. He was a learned person, Talmud Chacham, but a very, very interesting person also. At a certain point, he adopted for himself the levush of like a local Arab. The pictures of him has like a turban and long flowing robes. This is a Jew from Vilna, keep in mind. In the mid to late 1800s, he becomes a Shadar, which is a Shluch de Rabbanan, and he goes to travel the world to raise money for the Yishuv HaYashim that he was part of. Now, the part of the world that he decides to go to raise money is like untapped money, places no one has been, and he travels to Yemen, to India, Australia, Indonesia. He goes to fascinating places, and he writes a book called Evan Safir, or Masayis of Rabbi Yaakov Safir. Two halakim of it, he writes such a sefer that's full of very interesting vignettes from his travel. Now, Be'ikr, the port that he left through was the port of Aden, which is in Yemen, on the edge of the Arabian Peninsula, and he spent a lot of time in Yemen interacting with the Jews there, and he has the most to say about the Yemeni Jews and the most impact to the Yemeni Jews. Even at the Kach, that years later, after he had left Yemen already, there was it's like a crazy story. There was a Mashiach HaSheker, a guy who came and said he's Mashiach. He did his spiel. He would travel the country, very poor, and he would collect money towards the Mashiach endeavors, Mashiach Incorporated, Mashiach Inc., and eventually the Sultan or the Pasha or whoever it is that's ruling that area decides that he's a threat and has him put to death. He has his head cut off. His man is dead and buried, and a second man who probably looked nothing like the first man comes a few years later and says, I am him who came back from the dead. And he had like this crazy thing where he would after, I don't remember the exact details, but he would like dye his skin black or dark so that around his neck there would be like a whitish ring. And he would show people this is where his head was reattached, like a crazy story. And these were simple people, these were very backward people who believed stuff like this. And he was demanding exorbitant sums of money towards the new Mashiach Inc. And Rabbi Yaakov Safir from Yerushalayim wrote a letter. Igeres Teman Hashniya. The Rambam wrote Igeres Teman about Mashiach HaSheker, 800 years before him, but he wrote Igeres Teman Hashniya to tell them that this is not Mashiach and that they shouldn't follow him, and etc. So his impact that he leaves on Teman is much more direct and felt. Now, during his travels, he makes his way to India. In India, he bumps into a group of people called the Bnei Yisrael. Now, later, the Bnei Yisrael become a big shaila in the early state in Eretz Yisrael, because they claim to be Jews, the Bnei Yisrael, and they want to come to Eretz Yisrael and be married, intermarry people with the Rabbanut, and etc. And the Rabbanut, the whole kuntrus has to be published to ascertain exactly if they are Jewish, if they're not Jewish, and it becomes a big tumult later on in Israeli, Rabbanut politics. But Shia, they start in a little village, I think called Karako maybe, outside of Mumbai, outside of the center of India. And their origin story, if you believe them, their origin story is that they were Jews on a boat who were traveling. According to them, their origin story, it's B'imei HaMishnah. Like 2,000 years ago, they were traveling on a boat, many families. They were escaping and they got blown adrift and they were lost at sea for a long time. And eventually they land in India, not knowing where they are. And it was all that was left on the boat were 7 men and 7 women. They bury their dead and they start rebuilding their lives over there on the island, and they grow. But because they're so isolated and distant from the rest of Klal Yisrael, of course, there's a tremendous amount of amaratzas, and they don't really know much. In their history, they say that in about the year 1000, someone by the name of Reb David Halevi, I believe Reb David Halevi, they say, came and taught them, how to be Jews properly. He came and he recognized that they were, Jews, and he taught them how to be Jews properly, and from there they learned more. There's even like a legend that says, the Rambam famously has a letter that he writes mourning the early death of his brother Reb David, who had been a business person, who had like Yisachar Zvulun with the Rambam. He supported the Rambam, and the Rambam writes that he traveled to Haidu, to India, to do business, where he was killed. And there's even like a legend, it's probably not true, that this Reb David who educated the Bnei Yisrael was the Rambam's brother. In any case, they're a very far-flung, group of Jews that live where they live, with interesting minhagim. And in there, Rabbi Yaakov Safir brings down the minhag of upsharing that the Bnei Yisrael had. Now, it will sound similar, but not the same. And because of this, there were some people who made allegations. Let me just tell you what it is. He says when the kids turn 4 or 5 years old in these areas in India, the father or the family takes the child, they wrap him up in a long flowing beged, similar to a talis, and they take him to the shul, to the center of the kehillah, and they shave his head from end to end, tip to tip. Every single part of his head they shave. This is when the kid's 4 or 5 years old. They shave every part of his head, including the payas. Including the payas. And then what they do is they take, and if anybody is familiar with the sheitel sugya, they take the hair, they weigh it on a little scale, and whatever the hair that the child had in his head weighs, the father, kafi his money, will either donate in gold or silver or copper, whatever his financial standing is, he donates. Now this is very similar to a lot of different avodah. Like there's a lot of avodah zara elements. There's a lot of not Torah elements, shaving payas, even if it's only chinuch, etc. Fine. Now Rabbi Yaakov Safir writes that he told these people that this is not what you're supposed to do. You don't shave the payas. And they told him, and this was again something that should ring familiar to a lot of people. They told him, "Hayatachan for you to come and be mevatel a minhag that we have. Minhag is halig, and you can't shepherd with it. And even if you don't understand it, you leave it." So there's a lot of similarities, even if it's not. It's very different. There's a lot of similarities. So now, based on this episode, this story, there were some people, and it's brought down in different shuvas, that alleged that the whole minhag of upsharing is darkei amori. It comes from a goyish minhag of donating the value of hair, of like these Indian shaitels come from a pagan minhag, call it, of donating hair to the temple, to the as a sign of giving yourself over. And therefore, it would be like darkei amori or based on avodah zara, and it's something you should stay away from. Now, this is brought down in three different shuvas. L'maisa, the pashtus is that this is not the makar of the minhag that we have. The pashtus is taka that the Bnei Yisrael's minhag of shaving their hair in this manner does come from avodah zara. It's based on Indian culture, Indian pagan culture, which has a big significance to shaving hair and donating hair, and it l'chayra has nothing to do with the actual minhag of upshar. Meaning, it's just two similar phenomenons, one very avodah zara based, and one a little bit more mysterious and unclear where it comes from. But they're not similar enough to draw conclusions from one of them. And that's just like an oddity of a minhag that exists in some far-flung group in Klal Yisrael. So now, where is the actual minhag of upshar? Where does it come from? The pratim of it, the fact that it's at 3 years old, the bringing to shul, the bringing to yeshiva, for Yaki's other things. They bring vimpin to shul. They have different minhagim, whatever the different minhagim. So where does all these minhagim come from, and what's the source? Who, what, when, where, how? So let's see. So as follows. The main thing to know, and I'll start really backwards. The stipler in Archas Rabbeinu in Chelik Aleph, Rabbi Horowitz, the mechaber of the Archas Rabbeinu, said he asked the stipler about people bringing their children to Rabbanim to get do the first snip. Could he bring people to the stipler? The stipler said, no, he was not interested. If people come to me with this, I chase them out of my house, he says. I can read you the quote, but take my word for it. He says, people come to my house, he says, he says, he got very angry. im bakasha kazu megarsha. I chase him out of my house. Someone who comes with this type of request, I throw him out of my house, he says. So then Rabbi Horowitz told him, he says, I told the stipler, yeah, it's not for us, it's a chsidish minig. Now keep in mind, the stipler came from Chassidim. The stipler was a harness stipler, came from harness stipler. His father was a chassid of the harness stipler Rebbe. The stipler says, no, it's not a minig chassidim, it's a minig of the Svardim, the stipler told him. So the stipler, who was chassidish, told him that it's not a chassidish minig, it's a Svardi minig. Okay, now that just sets the table for us, where it starts. Now today, I think it's most known as a chassidish minig. But if you look at the earliest places that this minig is mentioned, every single one of them is in Svardi Svarim. It's brought down in all the different Svardic Meshivim. Let's say not that early, from the year, call it 1550 till the Chassidim exist. There's 35 or 40 different times that the minig of Halakha, which is an Arabic word, it's not even a Hebrew word. The minig of Halakha, which is an Arabic word for haircut, is brought down. And there's all different variations of this minig. And the different Svardic Chuvas is brought down to do it in a shul, or to do it by the kever of Shmuel Hanavi, or the kever of Kalba Savua, or to do it at 6 years old, or 5 years old, or 3 years old. There's a lot of different minhagim. It's not at all so standardized like the way we have it, like 3 years old to do it by by a rebbe or shiva. It's not so standardized. It's much more all over the map. But the minig is brought down in all these different svarim and shuvas to do this this halakha, to cut the hair. Now so this is a little bit vague, not so much tied into exactly the way we do it. Now, the place that maybe this makes the cross to us is by the Arizal, and I want to talk about it for a second. I just want to be maz one nakuda. In the Sephardic world today's Sephardim to us means people who came from Spain. That's Sephardim. The Sephardim who left Spain in 1492, they conquered the entire Sephardic world. They dispersed in every corner of the Islamic world, and they conquered every kahila that was there, became Sephardim like them. Before them, there was something called the Mistarvim, which means Jews who lived in Arab lands. Now, in a lot of these kahilas, in the 1500s, there would be two shuls. There would be a Sephardi shul and a Mistarvim shul. It was a different kahila with different minhagim. They had their own set of rules, their own thing. Lamashal in Egypt, there was the Radvaz writes about fights between these two different kahilas. The Radvaz has a few chuvas describing fights between these two different kilos in Egypt. So these were these two different kilos. Now this minig of halakha, of shaving the hair, maybe by Shmuel Navi's kever, maybe by Kabbalah Savua's kever, maybe we'll see by Shimon Nechai's kever, was a minig of the Mistarvim. It was a minig of Jews who lived under Islamic rule before the Svardim got there. So it's what we would call Svardim today, but it wasn't really Svardim. It's an earlier type of group of I don't know what you want to call them, Mistarvim, but Svardim-ish. Is where this minig really starts. Now I want to read you the Arizal's connection to this, and we'll see why that's an important taktam. The Arizal is brought down, Rav Chaim Vital in Shara Kavanas brings down this story with Arizal. I want to read it in its entirety, because there's a lot of different pieces over here that are relevant. We'll see how this ties in. So he says as follows like this. He says, he's talking about the Indian of going to Miron on Lag Ba'omer. That's what Rav Chaim Vital is discussing. He says as follows. He says, Indian minig shenagu Yisrael lelechas b'yem Lag Ba'omer al kivrei Rav Shimon ben Yochai Rabbi Elazar ben Noi. The minig that Klal Yisrael has to go visit, to patronize the kever of Reb Shimon ben Yochai and his son Reb Elazar, Ashakfurim be'ir Miron kenoida va'oichlem v'sheisim v'shmeichim sham. So he says, Ani re'isi l'Merizal. I saw Merizal, which is the Arizal, shehalach l'sham pamachas b'yem lag la'omer, not ba'omer, lag la'omer. I saw him go once on lag la'omer to Miron. Hu v'chol anshei beisei, him and his whole family, v'yashav sham shloisha yamim. He sat there for 3 days, Rishonim Shel Shavua, the first 3 days of the week. This was the first time that the Arizal came from Mitzrayim. Now, for those who know the Arizal's history, the Arizal grew up, he was like a Yasim. He grew up in Mitzrayim. He learned by the Radvaz, the Shita Mekubetzes. Eventually, he comes to Eretz Yisrael. It's unclear at exactly what point it was Niftachulei Shara Shemayim, that he became this Mekubal. But the Arizal came probably for one quick visit, then he went back to Mitzrayim, then he came for another visit, and then, the well springs of the Arizal opened up in Tzvas, where he lived, Sachakil, for about 3 years before he died. It was a very, very short kufa that the Arizal, was on the scene. Now, so he says this was the first time that the Arizal came from Mitzrayim, and this is important. He says, I'm not sure if at this point, when the Arizal came, if he was already a Baki, if he was Yedea in the Chachma and the Flaw that he later on became associated with. So the reason why Rav Chaim Vital is pouring a little cold water on it, like Minhag, meaning he's bringing the minig, and then he's pouring a little cold water and saying, I'm not sure, is because Rav Chaim Vital elsewhere in the Kavanas for Shvuas, and this is Yadua, and the Shari Tshuva brings us down in Shulchan Aruch, this is Yadua La'alacha, that the Arizal held that you're not allowed to shave your hair the entire days of Sfira. The Arizal didn't hold the first half and second half. And today, Hasidim, people in Yodechain, people in Medaktik hold like the Arizal, don't shave their hair for the entire Sfira. So to say that there'd be a minhag of the Arizal to go have the child's hair shaven on like La'omer is a little bit of a stira in the Arizal's own, shittas about Sfira Sa'omer. So the Rav Chaim Vital himself is being ma'ir this without saying this, that it's unclear exactly if this is like is this the Madur Basra, meaning is this the Saif Pasik? Is this what the Arizal landed up with at the end? Or is this something that the Arizal did at an earlier stage, but it's not something that he held all the way to the end of his life? Now, and this is why some of the Sif Svarim that bring down, Kabbalistic Minhagim from the Dar after the Arizal don't bring down the Indian of what do you call it, of Upshar. They don't bring it down because it's kind of a steer to the Arizal's own, like Ba'imer Minhagim. Now then he brings down as follows, and this is, he says, V'arav Rav Yechon Sagis, Heidli, Shabashana Hachas Kaidim Shalachti Ani Etzloi, Lomid Demari. Before me and him went to learn by the Arizal, Shahoylech Esbenaya Katan Sham Al Kol Anshe Beis. He took his son with all his family members, V'sham Gilchu Es Reishai K'minhag HaYedua. And there he shaved his head like the Minhag HaYedua, V'asa Sham Yem Mishta V'simcha. Now this is where Upsharon and the Arizal comes from. It's this few lines that the Chaim Vital brings down, that Rav Yechon and Sagis told him, that before, he says, Rav Yechon and Sagis told me that before I knew the Arizal, meaning it's third party information, Rav Chaim Vital never saw it himself. Somebody told him that he saw the Arizal go with his family and give his son a haircut in Miron and Lag Ba'omer. Now, there's a few nukudas that different Svarim, Kilo, the antis point out in this Rav Chaim Vital. First one is that, obviously, that it's secondhand, meaning it's coming from someone else who's telling him this. The third detail is that it's unclear, the language is not so clear if he means, he says, who went with all his family and shaved the head? Did Rabbi Yochanan Sagis go with his kid and give his kid an upsharon, or did the Arizal give his child an upsharon? He says, Shahoylech has b'noi hakatan sham v'klan shebeisei. Who took his child? Meaning that would make a difference if it's the Arizal who did it or it's someone else who did it. And the more important part of this, and this is really the part that I'm looking for to harvest over here, is that he says Gilchu es Reishei K'minhag HaYedua, like the pre-existing well-known minhag of getting an upsharon. Now, what he means to say with this is not the Arizal's minhag. The Arizal didn't invent this to get the upsharon, or to do it on Lag Ba'omer, or to do it on Har Miron. This is K'minhag HaYedua. There was a minhag that was known to them, which is the minhag of the Mistarvim, which is taka born out by all the different Svarim that quote him, which is the minhag of like old Jews who lived in Islamic lands, which would have included Eretz Yisrael at that time. They had a minhag to do this. Now, so Rav Chaim Vital brings it from the Arizal, but it's unclear to exactly what level of chaymer to attach to it. Like, is it the Arizal's Saif Pasik? Does it stem with the Arizal's other shittas about Lag Ba'omer? Was the Arizal himself the one who did it? So there's a little bit of like gray area, but this is the first source that's relevant to Ashkenazi Jews, to Polish Yidden and Hungarian Yidden and Litvish Yidden would be this shtickle from Chaim Vital and Shar Kavanas. Now, Lamaisa, it's not brought down in a lot of the Svarim of the day, the Kavanas Svarim of the day, and it's also not brought down in the Shulchan Aruch or any of the Nesei Kelim. None of the Nesei Kelim, even the Nesei Kelim that are want to bring down normally the Arizal, Mashal Magen Avram or the Shla, don't bring down this minhag of the Arizal, which again would imply that this was not perceived to be the minhag Ari, this was a minhag, an older minhag. So now, where did it finally make that cross, that shift into our world? So from what it seems like, it's hard to know this with any validity, from what it seems like based on the Svarim that discuss it and the Chuvas that talk about it, it would seem that it made the cross like in the second or third dar after the Baal Shem Tov was nifter. So call it the Baal Shem Tov was nifter in 1770, call it like, 1820, is when it really made the cross into our world. And the way you know that is because then suddenly you'll see dozens of chuvas from Paiskim, all who lived in Chassidish areas, all Paiskim who lived in areas where they were becoming Chassidish, were discussing the Prate Dinim and all the different Minhagim that are attached to getting an upshar. So then that's the easiest way to chart when something made it on the scene is when the rabbis start talking about it. Meaning the minute you start seeing shilas arising, if it could be Lamashal, a Shaila, could you do it for convenience? Could you do it before the kid turns 3 years old? What if the day of the birthday is not a good day for you? Could you push it off? Could you do it in a shul? Could you do it, a lot of different questions that are raised. What is exactly the minhag? Who should do it? Who has kedima? Different, obviously, pushback. People saying that it's Zarkei Amari and the minhag should be batal, and Rabbanim defending the minhag. So you start seeing that the minhag is brought down in all different svarim. Now, it's worth repeating that the legend has it that the Balatanya's upsharon was done by the Baal Shem Tov. So this predates, meaning Balatanya himself is like a dar shlishi, is the third dar of Chasidus, which is around the dar when this minhag would have been catching on. Legend has it that the Balatanya's parents Reb Baruch, and I forgot his mother's name. Teddy, help us out here. The Baal Tanya's parents, Reb Baruch, and I forgot his mother's name, were older and didn't have children, and they went to Mezhbish to be by the Baal Shem Tov and to ask the Baal Shem Tov to help to bless them with a child. And this is a whole story there, but he eventually gives them a bracha to have a child. They have only one. I'm not sure if they have any more after that. They have the Baal Tanya, and they end up living in Mezhbish and draying in Mezhbish for a little bit afterwards, meaning they don't leave right away. And the story goes that the Baal Shem Tov was the Baal Tanya's sandik at his upshare. So it bears repeating that exists. This is the some of the earliest sources about upshare that are discussed in detail is that Tzemach Tzedek had an anikel. I forgot his name now. It's slipping my name. The names are not coming today. But Tzemach Tzedek had an anikel who by his anikel's upsharon, he gave a Maimer Chassidus about upsharons. He gave a whole dissertation about upsharons, and in it he explains where it comes from and the side and whatever. Now he rather asks, and this is quoted Bishmai, he asks if upsharon is such a minhag chashiv like it was at that time by these kilos, and it became a very big deal. So why is it not brought down anywhere else besides this one-off remembrance in the Kisveri? Why is it not brought down in any of the Svarim, the Shulchan Aruch, and the Nisikalim, in the different Svarim? And he says, interesting, and I know nothing about this, but I could quote it. He says that the beard in Kabbalah represents the Yud Gimel Midas, which is connected the Yud Gimel Midas Shater addresses behem. I'm just quoting. The payas, which is above the beard, is kilu higher, even higher than the Yud Gimel Midas, and therefore it's above being mentioned in the Svarim, and it has to be something that's left off the table. This is I can read you the quote if you need it, but this is what he says to be masbrit. So it's for Yodechein, it's al pisai, the different reasons that are given, what exactly the reason why payas is such is above being mentioned, and what the chshivas is. Now, how did this come to? I just want to point out this some sarcastic comment from Briskerov. Briskerov, when he would bring people to get upsharons, it was probably the first time he bumped into it when he came to Eretz Yisrael. Meaning Brisk was a very Litvish city. He probably never did upsharons in Brisk. He came to Eretz Yisrael, which was a melting pot. There's a lot of different kilas, and it became Gad Ladar. So people came to bring him, children of upsharons. Briskerov used to tell them, "I'm not a barber. I don't want to do this." Now, this is brought down in a lot of different svarim. Moshe Sternbuch brings down that he heard this himself. And Chelik Beis and Chuvas Minhag, Moshe Sternbuch brings down he heard the Briskerov say Chminish Ken Sharer. And the way that the Masber is, Briskerov is Masber to the people around him, and this is classic Brisk. He said, you're not over on the Isser of not having pace if you have long hair. If you grow your hair, your whole hair down to your shoulders, you have pace also. There's no din that your pace have to be standing out in Yuchad. You have pace. So you bring me a kid with hair down to here, he has pace. You tell me shave everything off so that now just the pace is visible. That's a barber's job. That's not pace. You can't give someone pace. That's a barber's job. So I'm not a barber. This is Briskerov's bikoret on the minhag. He wanted no part. And Ramesh Steinbach rather says that the Briskerov said, Leishmieli, I never heard of this minhag, Kilemer Leisvirili. Like as if to say I don't hold of this minhag. But only in regards to the part of a Adam Gadol doing the haircut part. Meaning Briskerov, of course, knew of the minhag of Upshar. I mean, at that point, it was an extremely widely known minhag that had spread through all of Poland and Hungary and etc. Meaning, Briskerov, of course, knew of the minhag. He meant the part of an Adam Gadol doing the haircut. Briskerov wasn't into that. Now, so how does this come to be attached to 3 years old? What's the connection? So as follows. In Shulchan Aruch, in Hilchos Talmud Torah, in Siman Reish Mem Ches, I think it is, the Shulchan Aruch talks about a father's obligation. No, it's Reish Mem Vav. Reish Mem Hey, 1 second. Reish Mem Vav. The Shulchan Aruch talks about a father's obligation to teach his child how to learn. And the Shulchan Aruch says, why can't I find it now? Reish Mem Hey, hang on 1 second. Here you go. Shulchan Aruch says as follows. When does a person start teaching his son? When the kid starts talking, you start teaching that pasuk. Pasuk Rishon Parashat Shema. Then you teach him a little bit at a time. Until he turns like 6 years old, like Shiva. Because then you bring him to yeshiva to really learn. Now this is really based on a famous Gemara in Sukkot. The Gemara says when Katan Yedei, the Gemara says as follows. It's more in Sukkot Membeis. Katan Yedei l'nanei chayav b'lulav l'satev chayav b'tzitzis. And from there, that Gemara is the Gemara that tells us about chinuch, that it's age specific. Meaning each mitzvah, when a child becomes able to or aware of that minhag, the father has a mitzvah's chinuch to start teaching the child that. Now, in Sif Ches over here in the Shulchan Aruch says like this. Maschilim atinoikes l'Islam ben 5 shanim shleimus. When a kid turns 5 years old, you bring him into learn. Pachs mikan, ein machnisin oiseh. V'mu kachosh machnisin oiseh ben 6. If he's a shvacha kid, you wait till he's 6 years old. Shleimus. Now here's the Ramah. Haga, mikol makim, miyad sheyeh ben shalei shanim. As soon as the child turns 3 years old, shleimus, v'lamden oiseh oiseh satayrik t'shiyar galatz milikers b'tayr. You start teaching him aleph beis, so that he could at least, be able to read and start learning. And this is the Ramah quoting in the Barbanel, that says that at 3 years old you start teaching him. Now the Goin, Afanor right over here, asks the Stira. That the Mechaber says at an older age, which is really based on the Mishnah and Avos, it says Ben Chamish Lemikra. You start teaching him when he's 5 years old. Ramah now seems to be saying when he's 3 years old you start teaching him Aleph Beis, you know what's going on. And the Goin brings him a car, which is it's a medrash and a mechilta that says as follows. That says the pasuk says Shalosh Shanim Arelim you by Arla of Tvua. For 3 years you leave it, you don't cut it. Shana Haravias, the 4th year, then you get to cut the Arla and start with the Arla. Now the Mechilta and the Medrash Rabbah says, the Medrash Tanchuma, says that the same thing is by a katan. Katan, Adshu, Shalosh Shanim Rishainis, he doesn't know how to talk, he doesn't know how to read, he doesn't know how to learn, he's an Arla. Arelim to you. But Bashana Ravias, then he's able to start learning. So there's a Mechilta and a Medrash that seems to say that at 4 years old, that when a kid turns 3, I guess, I don't know, the kid turns 3, there's he crosses a certain Rubicon and he's ready to start learning. And from there is what the Ramah was based on. The Ramah says that when the kid turns 3 years old, you should start teaching him Aleph Beis already, so that he could start, engaging with Psukim. And the Goin brings down Mukhi Yosef and a Rif that says he's supposed to start teaching him Lashon Kodesh. Meaning there's other things that start happening at that age. So, Ki'ilu, at 3 years old, there's some sort of din that now this child is somewhat more shayach to learning, is somewhat more available to being, educated and to being taught. So there are those who feel that, hey, Yois, you're going to start treating this child a little bit more like a big boy, for lack of a better word, and you're going to start teaching him a little bit, and you're going to send him to cheder a little bit. So Mela, it doesn't make sense that he should come in looking like a baby, with long hair. So you make him look like a grown up, like a yid. You give him a yarmulke, and you give him payas, and maybe tzitzis, and you make him look like how a bigger, kid is supposed to look, so that he's ready to start learning. Based on this 3 years. Now, God, I saw that the Lubavitch Rebbe, whose yahrzeit was just a few days ago, he mentions in a letter that people wrote him that if the din is like Arla, then the first 3 years it should be asur to teach the kid anything. I mean, you shouldn't. Arla is asur for 3 years, then it becomes mutter. And he says, the Lubavitch Rebbe says that he has heard that there's a minhag not to teach. For Ulai, he says there's a chilik between Teresh Shabbat and Teresh Shabbat. You could teach Messiah, you could teach whatever it is to be a Yid without teaching learning. Like it's interesting that there should be such a din. The mashal for upsharons, you'll find the different poskim, and I can't go into all the different pratim, but different poskim that talk about it say not to do it before the kid turns 3. Midin Arla. Like the Arelim Tiyu is that this din is up to 3 years old. So this is how probably putting together this piece of the Chi of Chinuch with 3 years old and the old, pre-Svardik minig of shaving the hair together turned into the minhag of Absharon, which Apisayid, is brought down to have, very deep meanings. And eventually this minhag caught on in wide swaths, so that today even people who are Litvish, but who have, some Chassidish stock or come from some Chassidish background, do Absharons. Befrat, we always like parties, I'm saying? It's not a very hard minhag to adapt, to become popular. The minhag became very popular, but it's just interesting to know, and I don't think people realize this, that the minhag itself is not that old. I mean, relatively speaking, it's a relatively newish minhag. I don't call it 200 years. Based earlier, obviously for other kilos. For people sitting in this room, for the most part, it's be'erach a 200-year minhag that became very chashiv and taka in all the chuvas. And I'm not going to be able to go through any of them now. But Levushim Mordechai and Reb Maram Brisk and Reb David Lelever and Mary Primishlana's Eidim and the Tal, a lot of different svarim that talk about it. All of them, for their own reasons, the Riyatzav has several chuvas about it, are very, very, stark, that people who have this minhag should keep this minhag, and it's a heilig minhag that has, deep meanings up beside, which is above my pay grade. But people, Mashal, the Sefer Shashim Minhag Ashkenaz, which is about the Yekish Minhagim, and really the Yesod for all, Litvish Minhagim, not even Litvish, Polish Minhagim. So he says that the minhag is not to do it at all. And Adarab in the Marilla Mashal and Revival, it's brought down that the age to give a child his first haircut is when they turn 12 weeks old. So, Zebukay is Zebukay, whatever your minhag is. If it's 12 weeks, if it's 3 years, if you know anyone who's from Bnei Yisrael and it's 6 years, so then that's their minhag. It's a lot of different, different minhagim. Now, interesting to note, and this is the part that gets lost in the shuffle, is that the minhag of bringing the kid to yeshiva, which is like an addendum to the Abshar, and that not everyone does, is the much more important part of the minhag. Rashi B'Shem Rashi, and the Machzavitri brings down B'Shem Rashi, the Rikeach, other Rishonim bring down that this was taka an old German minhag, meaning that's at least 1,000 years old, probably older, based on the Gemara and Sukkah, and based on actual Chazals, that's much more specific about this is the way to bring a child into like his Yemei HaChinuch, meaning the way to mark a child's entry into the Yemei HaChinuch, that he's now Higia L'Chinuch and you're going to start raising him and teaching him, is to bring him to yeshiva. And those minhagim like the Oisis B'Dvash and those other minhagim that are the less popular part of the Upsharon are much, much more ancient and much more well-sourced. So it's interesting that what got lost in the shuffles, the haircut became the very popular part, but the part that's the real old Ashkenazic minhag from at least 1,000 years ago and likely much older is the part that got lost in the shuffle. So I guess if one is doing an Upsharon, if that's the minhag, so Taka at least incorporate the part of bringing to yeshiva as well. Okay, Yashikayach.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.